Copyright is a bundle of exclusive rights for creators or their copyright holders to do the following with their works. If you have a copyright, you are able to distribute your work. You could sell it. You could also publicly perform or display it. You could make copies. So whether it's to make a copy for your class or make a copy for colleagues, you could do that if you have a copyright for your work. You could also create derivatives, which means if you were to write a book, you could create a movie or a screenplay with that particular work of yours. And then finally, copyrights give you the ability to transfer those rights for others to do it. So if you don't intend to distribute your work, usually it may be a publisher that might distribute your research or a paper that you had written, you would transfer that right to them. Copyright protections are available for certain types of work. They can fall under literary works, which can be textual, like your articles that you write for journals and publications. This also has computer programs and code qualify as literary works because they're text-based. Your musical works, if you're in that field, can be your compositions, lyrics, and even performances, each of which can have copyright protection. Dramatic works like dances, pantomimes, and choreography can also have copyright protection, and so could pictorial, graphic, and cultural works. As we know, motion pictures and other audiovisual works like CDs or sound recordings may have copyright protection. And then architectural works also have the same. So here's some other relevant legal basics for you. Copyright is automatically granted once an idea is in a fixed form. So one thing that you may have seen that all of those particular things that could get copyright protection have in common is that they're an intangible form that you could see, touch, taste, or hear. Registration is recommended for legal purposes, so it's not necessarily legally necessary to get a copyright registration to get the copyright protection. However, it is recommended for legal purposes, like if there's an infringement lawsuit involved, or if you just want to document that you own the copyrights over your work. The current edition of copyright law of the United States provides legal definitions, parameters, and exceptions. The U.S. Copyright Office at copyright.gov is who registers all the copyrighted works in the U.S. You can go to them for information on copyright, and they've got these things called circulars that explain things in a few pages. So next we'll go into fair use, small, mighty, yet misunderstood. But first, let's go into some myths and facts about fair use. I think those of you who've been teaching for quite a while have probably heard a variety of things from conferences or publications that you've read or other workshops like you had here. So I just wanted to list some very commonly held myths and then some facts to go with them. So myth number one, any educational or scholarly use is fair use. So if you ever use a copyrighted work for teaching purposes, it's always going to be fair use, or so the myth goes. But the truth or the fact is that fair use is determined by the objective facts for an intended use. So fair use and its analysis really helps you discern those facts and then helps you decide if you feel your use qualifies for fair use, even if it is for an educational or scholarly purpose. Another myth that's constantly heard is using 10 or 15% or even a proportion of a work is fair use. This is actually based in a very old guideline by people who did interlibrary loan and other people in education in the library field. It's kind of like a guideline, and I'll go into that in just a moment. A fair use analysis actually considers the amount use as one of its four factors, but amount is not the only factor that determines whether or not a use means it's fair use. So we'll go into the four factors of fair use in just a moment, but using 10 or 15% of work does not necessarily mean it is fair use. Sometimes it could, but not necessarily always. And a third fair use fact, a third fair use myth. Fair use is too confusing and intimidating to use. So a lot of educators do shy away from using fair use because there are no cut and dry measurements or qualifications or things like that. So a lot of people don't want to use it. However, fair use is like a muscle. The more you work it, the more you learn, the stronger your knowledge gets. And you can successfully use copyrighted items for your fair use and for your educational or scholarly purposes. Fair use, small mighty. So what is fair use? It is an exception in US copyright law that allows some use of copyrighted materials to be reused or copied without permission of a copyright holder. So this means that if you wanted to use, say, part of a journal article or maybe a chapter, for instance, of a book for your teaching purposes, you may be able to do that without permission. Fair use applies for limited and transformative purposes. That's probably like the main part of the fair use definition. If you're going to use a copyrighted work in limited amounts, and transformative, meaning that you're going to use a work different than its intended purposes, that's going to be a transformative purpose. There's three scenarios where fair use applies. We've got parody. So I'm sure we all know about Weird Al Yankovic and his parody for pop music. He's parodied Michael Jackson, James Brown, Nirvana, the rock group. A lot of people joke that if Weird Al makes a parody out of your music, then you made it. Well, fair use is what allows Weird Al to do what he does and to make these entertaining songs based on an original version of someone else's work. Fair use may also apply in commentary and critique, which is a very big part of what we all do as educators, instructors, and faculty. So fair use allows us to take a copyrighted work, like a song or even a study or some other work, and you can comment, you could make comments on it, you could critique it, you could analyze it, you could talk about a particular work for intellectual, scholarly, and perhaps teaching uses. And then fair use also applies for news. So when you watch WRLN or NPR or WPTV or anything like that, fair use allows the newscasters to report on things that happen. So here's where small comes in for the fair use definition. When you look at US copyright law, the fair use clause is really only 147 words long. It's like only a paragraph in this, which is basically well over 100 pages of law that basically outline copyright. You can find it in US Code 17, Section 107. However, even though it's only 147 words long, it's very mighty because it's used for the teaching, research, scholarship, and other creative activities. Fair use is what gives educators, scholars, creatives, and other academics a lot of leeway to use or reuse copyrighted works for their purposes. However, it is very misunderstood. So going back to that fair use myth about using 10 to 15% of a work is considered fair use, I wanted to add this. Although educational communities of practice created guidelines to play it safe, that is the old 10, 15, or 20% rule for copying, fair use is actually considered on a case-by-case basis. A fair use analysis, which we'll be talking about shortly, will assist you with evaluating your intended use of a work for your instructional, scholarly, or creative purposes. So we're going to go into how you can do your own fair use analysis. But before we begin, I wanted to give you some examples of fair use that might actually surprise you. Copying and sharing. So let's just say your partner downloads a Baby Yoda graphic from Star Wars site and uses it as their mobile screensaver. Since your partner is just using this Baby Yoda site that the Star Wars company and Disney and whoever else posted it gave them permission for their own personal use, they were able to do that. That probably would not be considered copyright infringement. It's kind of like something they want to do for their fans to keep the enthusiasm and spirit up and let more people know about Baby Yoda, perhaps. Another example of copying and sharing when fair use is applied is when a professor sends a PDF of their article to a colleague who wants to review it. So I think the vast majority of publishers will allow you, if you published an article, to have a PDF of it and send it to a colleague, one person, just so that they could review it. So that's an example of fair use. The reviewing usually falls under the critique and commentary. It's a very limited distribution that you're doing in that case. So that's an example of copying and sharing in a fair use instance. Teaching and research. This first bullet, when I first found out about that, surprised me. When your students paraphrase and quote information from articles and also cite it for an assignment, that is actually considered fair use. And I think that's a wonderful and very powerful example of fair use because the whole intention of fair use is to use existing scholarship and other creations and create more. Kind of like how Isaac Newton, the physicist, said, if I've achieved great things, it is because if I've seen great things, it is because I stood on the shoulders of giants. I may have not given the quote in verbatim, but the sense was he was able to do things because he built off the work of other people. So paraphrasing and quoting information so that your students can learn more and get creative with that particular knowledge is a huge fair use instance. Teaching and research. An instructor shows clips from their personal Blade Runner CD to demonstrate the attributes of dystopian films. This is actually what a colleague of mine had done in their film studies class. They had their own personal version of Blade Runner and would show like maybe 3-minute clips, then go into his lecture and then show another few minutes and then go further into why, what made Blade Runner dystopian and what are some attributes. And of course, the students were really entertained by the action sci-fi aspect of it too. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think, was in that one. So who's not entertained, right? and they get to learn. And repurposing is another broad example of fair use. Here was something else that surprised me about fair use. Internet search engines distill metadata from web pages and reorganize them into search results. So every time we use Google or some other search engine, like maybe Firefox, I think, um, they don't really need to get copyright permission for the billions of web pages that are out there. What they do is their web spiders crawl the web pages to get some metadata from it, so the metadata being what describes the main characteristics of the pages there. And then they kind of pull that information and give it to you, condense it in the search results that you get. So, Google and tech companies actually rely very heavily on fair use to do what they do. And then another example of repurposing is when a book's text is converted into audio for a visually impaired student. So there is a part of copyright law that does allow some use of that for people who cannot read text. So that's an example of repurposing. Text with the intention of being seen visually and read is converted into audio so it could be heard. And, well, the people with sight issues, they read, but it's just a different way of reading too, but they repurpose what was initially text for a different use. So those are the three broad examples of fair use: copying and sharing, teaching and research, and repurposing. So next we'll do a walkthrough with the fair use analysis. A fair use analysis objectively reviews attributes of its 4 factors for a given scenario. I like to use the mnemonic PAIN to describe the 4 factors of fair use. You got the purpose, or why a particular work is being used, the amount or how much of it will be used, the nature or what it is you want to repurpose or use for your teaching, and the effect on the market. And I'll go into those 4 factors in just a moment. And I wanted to let you know that we do have a form available for you. If you go to the bit.ly/3CPEYR, you can go to the form that can help you determine whether or not your use may be fair. And I will go into these in just a moment, but here you have also the broader purpose of the work being used, the amount, the nature, and the effect, and then the factors that weigh towards or against fair use. So the purpose of a use and a work's character is the first factor. So here's where you ask yourself, what is the reason for using the work? Are you doing this to teach a point? Do you want to make a point more clear? Or are you going to be gone for a conference and you just want the students to watch a movie so they're doing something? I mean, hey, we've all done that. How long will the work be used? Are you going to be using this particular work for the semester long basis in your class, or is it going to be during one course? That's something you'll answer. The transformative use is the key part of fair use, and that's when you ask yourself, will the use add a new meaning, character, or function of the work? Kind of like how I just explained how a textual work can be converted to an audio work to accommodate a blind student or people with visual impairments. So are you taking something that was intended to entertain for a teaching purpose or something like that? And then part of the purpose of a use and a work's character also has you determine under what conditions will it be made available. So are you going to be posting or using a copyrighted work openly available on a web page? Or are you going to be using it in Canvas where only your students will get to read it? So this is part of what can help you determine the purpose of a use. Then you go into the amount, and then I added substantiality of a work. Here's where you ask yourself how much is being used in proportion to the original work. Are you using a chapter out of a, say, 10-page chapter book? Are you only using like 5 to 6 pages out of a 300-page book? Here's where you take that to task. And then you ask yourself if the portion is the most significant part of the work. Are you using the heart of the work, or are you using the reason why everybody wanted to look at, buy, or read, or even listen to the work in the first place? So you ask yourself how much of are you using of a particular copyrighted work, and is it the heart of the work or the most substantial part of it? And then the nature. What kind of work are you using? Is it a work based on fact, like a scholarly article based on research or a biography? Or is it going to be a creative work, like a movie, a song, or even works of art or graphics? You'll also consider if the work is published or unpublished, and if the purpose of the work is to form, entertain, or if it's something like an aesthetic work. The effect of the work is where you ask yourself, does copying or reusing the work make it less valuable or loosen its demand? So let's just say you were going to have the students take a look at a chapter of a book. Would that keep the students from having to buy the book, and that would affect the demand for the book or not? So here's where you ask yourself that question. So the purpose, amount, nature, and effect are the four fair use factors that you could take a look at to determine if your use would be fair use. So some things to keep in mind. Fair use is not numerically determined. So you could say, yes, I think my purpose, amount, and nature weighs in favor of fair use, but my effect does not. That's 3 out of 1. Well, it's not necessarily how it works. It's actually based on a balance of the factors here. Transformative use, as I mentioned quite a bit about in the purpose part, does add more weight in the particular fair use analysis. I had an instance not long ago where if I numerically evaluated fair use, it was basically 2 out of 2. Okay, it's not necessarily numerically determined. But what I think really tipped my fair use analysis to saying this may work in favor of fair use was a transformative piece. Oh, and then the other part was I found out that this particular work was out of print and our people could hardly get to it. So that also helped me with the fair use determination in the E part or the effect. So ultimately, a fair use decision is made on the following. You're going to take a look at the details of your use. Is it going to be in your class setting, or what kind of class setting is it? Is it for your face-to-face class? Is it an online class? Is this something you're going to be giving in class during face-to-face session, or is it going to be something you'll post on Canvas? Also, the type of work would be an issue in your fair use decision, and also whether you're using your own personal copy of a work or a licensed version that you may get from a library. And then also, as I'd mentioned, weighing and balancing the PA and E factors is going to be something else you'll take a look at. And then also your tolerance for risk. You've got some people who are very confident about things and may interpret fair use very openly. And then you have some people who just don't want to deal with the possibility of a lawsuit or something like that. And so they may do a much more conservative interpretation of fair use. Now, fair use can be complicated, and I know that the details I just went over kind of can be a little daunting, but experts assert that it does enable the following. So it helps you teach. You know, it's very good for educational purposes and for sharing education. Ideas beget more ideas. Exchanging ideas helps the knowledge and helps the student really get this information. It also helps with new knowledge and innovation. So as I mentioned in that Isaac Newton quote, first we had the regular turbine engine steam vehicle, then we had the vehicles with more efficiencies, and now we're going towards electric vehicles and things like that. So they had to start from somewhere. And then fair use is also supportive of creative and cultural expression. I mean, we want to promote the arts, we want to promote creative expressions and works, and of course also free speech. Okay, so next we're going to be evaluating some fair use scenarios. Once again, we have a form for that. So if you want to take a look at the form or have it on your tablet or something that you're looking at, you could see about these following scenarios and see how much they weigh towards fair use or against fair use. Okay, so scenario one, your student wrote a paper on Watergate, and he used 4 lengthy block quotes from Gerald R. Ford's memoir, where the 38th U.S. president explained why he pardoned former President Richard Nixon. Would you think this follows fair use? Think about the purpose. So your student's writing a paper for an assignment, the amount, 4 lengthy block quotes, the nature. So it was Gerald R. Ford's memoir, which is kind of like a nonfiction or factual based work, and then the effect. So fair use makes paraphrasing and using the work of others possible for student work. But what are some scenarios that may come up, or no, what are some issues that may come up for this scenario? Well, first I think about 4 lengthy block quotes. So that's not necessarily paraphrasing, they're actually using the actual part of the work. It could be constituted as plagiarism, possibly, if this person does not quote the work or does not cite the work. The case of this autobiography was actually a real live case where somebody had, it was The Nation magazine that cited, I think, like not quite a page of Gerald R. Ford's memoir about where he explained why he pardoned the former president. And Gerald R. Ford's publisher had sued the magazine for using that part, and the court actually ruled in favor of the publisher who had the copyright. And the reason was that the magazine had put down the most substantial part of the work or the heart of the work, or why people would buy Gerald R. Ford's memoir. This may favor against fair use, perhaps, especially if he used the parts where he talked about that. But also, since they used 4 lengthy block quotes, you may want to advise a student about paraphrasing or the appropriate use of block quotes. Or maybe this person needed to take up space and was worried about he wouldn't fulfill the page minimum for the paper. But sometimes you have to really look at the reason why he's explaining or using the block quotes. So chances are this may not, or it possibly could be if he's not using the reasons why he pardoned the former president. Here's a second example. For an in-person class, Professor Ocean wants to copy 15 pages out of a 350-page book she owns and gives them to her students in tomorrow's session. She thought its explanation of a concept she is teaching would help her students better understand it. Okay, so for her face-to-face class, she wants to copy 15 pages out of a 350 book. It's for educational purposes. So the purpose is education. It's going to be at a face-to-face class. Let's see, it looks like it's only going to be used for this one-time instance. The amount, 15 out of 350 pages, okay. That might be okay with the amount as long as it's not like the reason why everybody buys the book. The nature, we don't really know what kind of class this is. If it's a creative work, like it's a picture of like art or graphics, which may weigh against fair use. Doesn't necessarily say it's not, but just weighs against it. Or maybe it's oceanography class based on fact, which would weigh for fair use. And then the effect. So we really wouldn't we wouldn't really expect a student to buy a whole book just for 15 pages. So we could kind of consider that maybe this 15 pages isn't really going to affect the demand of the book. So that's the thought there for the effect. Now, if this were in an online class, it might be a bit different. But let's just focus on the in-person class. So a lot of times, a lot of fair use experts would say like a small portion of a book would definitely weigh for fair use and educational purposes face to face. Now, online, it may have a little more considerations, especially restrictions, but a lot of times they say if it's in a closed um, environment like a Canvas page, they could do that. We could also have the students buy the book instead, especially if your fair use is very, if you're risk aversive towards that, you could possibly do that and skip the fair use as well. So just to kind of show you, there's always multiple things you could do for fair use, multiple ways and directions you could go. Okay, so number 3, instructor Sunny found a PDF of an expensive textbook on the internet. They want to download 4 chapters and make them available on Canvas so the students don't have to buy the book. But otherwise, a lot of times the experts usually say that if you do something so that the students don't have to buy a book, that is in favor, I'm sorry, that's against fair use in terms of the effect. So a lot of times if people say they're doing something so students don't have to buy a book, especially one that's readily available, it may affect the market of a book or the effect. So sometimes that may not weigh for fair use. One person asked, what about the age of the book? Okay, I did have a question recently, something very similar to this, and the book was out of print. So if the book's out of print, it's not really going to affect the market of or demand of a book, really, especially if no one's publishing it anymore. So that may weigh in favor of a fair use too. I've been asked if using previous editions may help with the fair use assessment. I haven't really read much about it, but I imagine it may help it a little bit because everybody wants the more recent version of the book, and sometimes the previous editions may be out of print or hard to get to, perhaps. But that may weigh a little bit in favor. And then someone asked if they wondered if an out of print book would be available on Google Books. It's very possible it may be, or maybe on the HathiTrust or the Internet Book Archive. So there are some legal versions of books that are available on the internet that you could check into and use those for materials and not worry about a fair use or copyright infringement issue. Okay, here's a tricky one, and I think this is one we've all been asked or wonder about quite a bit. During a live session for your online class, you want to show a documentary you found on Amazon Video in its entirety, and then follow it up with discussion. The documentary shows different sides of a debate that you think your students should see to understand its nuances. Okay, so we're going back to the details. You want to look at the objective facts or details of a book, or I'm sorry, an item you want to use. So in this case, purpose, it's going to be for an online class and a discussion. And you want to use the whole, for the amount, you want to use the entire video. The nature, it's an online work that's governed by licenses. Amazon Prime Video does have specific clauses that say that it's for their video viewing is for personal use, home-based use only. So it makes no mention of educational uses, if I'm not mistaken, but the license really does not say you can at the same time for an entire work. So that weighs against fair use. And then the effect of the demand of the work. Some people might say that maybe it increases the demand of a work, but I think Amazon Prime might say, no, it doesn't. So that's one issue though. Things you find on streaming videos like Hulu or Amazon Prime or Netflix are licensed works, and you really want to be sure you read the license for it and to see what it allows you to do and not do. I'd say that maybe if the person uses little clips of the work, and if Amazon's license says fair use can be considered for pieces of the work, maybe, but I'm not familiar enough with it right off the bat to see if it allows such uses or if it forbids it altogether. But using it would also from Amazon Prime would be kind of like you have to follow their license. Someone asked if it's free. Would it make a difference if it's free? That's a big question that brings up pirated works. Like if you just find something on YouTube, for instance, there's a chance it may be pirated and the copyright holder may not have permission. Ethically speaking, that's not really the ethical thing to do. And plus, it may be taken down by the copyright owner at any notice, and it may not be available when you need it. So there's another issue there. But a lot of questions are coming up about the videos I see. Now I'll get to those at the end. Um, so I will give you some better practices to follow since based on the questions we've been getting. It's always good to check a work's copyright if it's available or if it has a Creative Commons license. Creative Commons license is something that creators will attach to their copyrighted works that dictate how they could use the works. Like you could use, like CC BY means like if you just tell everybody that who wrote the work or made the work and give it attribution, that's acceptable use. So check a work's copyright and you could see if it's in the public domain where it doesn't have copyright protection. And then this would also help you request permission if you want to do that to reuse a copyrighted work. You could also do your fair use analysis and also ask for help if you need it. I've had people reach out to me to ask about fair use, and you ultimately make the decision about that. But what I do is I distill the facts of it, and so you could kind of see how it balances for or against. Another fair use better practice is to use works that are licensed or acceptable for use in online settings. So online library materials can generally be used for instruction due to their licenses. So when we purchase access to something on Canopy or Alexander Street Press, there is something in the license that says, yes, you can use it for educational purposes. We also recommend to use legally obtained and legal versions of works. As I'd mentioned, you really want to shy away from pirated works, and we don't know when it's going to be there or gone. But I think number 5 here really points to the 4th point here. Model the practices that you want your students to follow. So we don't, if we're using pirated works for our teaching and instruction, the students would think, oh, it's okay if I do that too. I mean, we are role models for the students, and they do, they look at us more than we might think, believe it or not. But those are some 5 better practices that I could recommend that you could follow for fair use in copyrighted works. So for some recommended information sources, we do have some copyright library guides that are available. We have the Copyright for Teaching and Learning Research Guide that includes information about fair use, in-class use, and other topics related to copyright and teaching. And there is a part that talks about using videos for class. So if you go to that bit.ly, you can go see information about copyright and fair use. We also have the Copyright Research Guide that you could take a look at for some general basics on copyright, and then also the Scholarly Communication Services webpage. And as I mentioned earlier, the Copyright Office is the American version that gives copyright registration, also information for copyrights too. And then of course the Stanford University Library's webpage, Copyright and Fair Use Overview, is a very good introduction to fair use written in more layman's terms. Okay, so now I'll open up the floor to some questions. I'm going to minimize my screen a little bit so that I could see the questions you may have. Okay, so one person asked, Lori asked if it makes a difference whether she shares information in a face-to-face versus an online class after a fair use assessment. And it does make a difference in the settings because face-to-face does tend to weigh in favor for fair use. Online, it's not that it doesn't or you cannot share things online because of using fair use, but you have to really take a careful look at it, like who's it going to be available for, how long will it be available, how much are you going to be using. So if you're going to share information online, you really got to take a look at the factors of amount, the nature, and the effect of doing something online. How can a person determine if something they find on the internet is pirated? I would take a look at the web page where it's being made available and to take a look if there's a copyright statement on it. So for instance, like if you find something on YouTube or Vimeo, if you look at who posted it, like if it's the publisher or the author that posted it, chances are it may not be a pirated work, but if it's published by somebody whose name you can't determine, like Just Baby Love 313 posted this on YouTube, well, and you don't know who Just Baby Love really is, chances are it may be a pirated work. So always take a look at the source of who posted that information. That does make such a big difference there. Are there other sources that people could use besides Amazon if they want to use streaming videos? As I mentioned, the FAU Libraries does have a lot of licensed educational videos and documentaries, and I believe we had the Criterion collection as well of movies. So the movies and the documentaries and the sources we get does have a license for educational uses, so that's one option that you could use. I do know that Netflix does have limited availability for documentaries that they produced, but that information's not the easiest to find, unfortunately. So that's another option that you have. Another thing that you could do too is if you see something on the internet, like a movie or documentary or clips, and the copyright holder gives a Creative Commons permissions to reuse it, that's another way that you could find that information. But there are a lot of search engines for Creative Commons works, so you could identify those too.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We appreciate this.